Why would a man full of life, a man who had just taken out a $117,000 loan to grow his business, be found inside his Tesla in a way that didn't match the future he was planning? On April 5, 2024, Gwinnett County, Georgia. Neighbors thought it was a simple problem at first, a car running too long in a closed garage. But the smoke slipping out from under the garage door wasn't normal, and the engine never changed tone, not once. They knocked. They called his name. Nothing. The silence coming from inside that garage didn't fit the man they knew. Steady, hard-working, always talking about tomorrow. By the time first responders stepped onto the driveway, the whole cul-de-sac understood something was off. This wasn't the scene you expect from someone who just invested heavily in his future. They ruled it as suicide, until his widow wife purchased a Ferrari.
Hi, Ferrari, we're north of the alleyway, Endorse Street, Rockford, inside.
David Mercer's story didn't begin on the day neighbors gathered outside his garage. It began decades earlier in Macon, Georgia, where he grew up under the steady hand of his mother, Ruth, who raised her children with simple rules: work hard, stay humble, and honor the people who stand by you. David absorbed those values early, learning what responsibility meant long before other boys his age even thought about it. He wasn't the loud kid, or the one always chasing attention, but he was the one people trusted to show up when they needed help, whether it was mowing a neighbor's lawn or carrying groceries for the elderly couple across the street. Ruth saw a quiet determination in her son, something sturdy and dependable that she protected as best she could while balancing jobs to keep their small household running. Those early years shaped David into the kind of man who believed a future worth having had to be built the right way, step by step, even if it took longer than most were willing to wait. As he entered adulthood, those lessons stayed with him, becoming the foundation for the life he wanted. After high school, he worked a string of odd jobs before saving enough to buy a used van that barely held itself together, but to David it represented possibility. He spent nights teaching himself route mapping, local delivery patterns, and maintenance work, determined to push the business forward one job at a time. Slowly, the van turned into 2, then 3, and eventually into a small fleet that caught the attention of younger drivers looking for steady work. They started calling him Boss D, a nickname that stuck not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through fairness, structure, and the kind of leadership that didn't need big speeches or intimidation. His drivers respected him because he respected them first, and he paid them well, remembering the years when every paycheck he earned had to stretch farther than it should. Faith became David's anchor through all the years he built that company, grounding him in patience whenever obstacles threatened to knock him off balance. He wasn't the type to move impulsively or make decisions out of ego. He thought, prayed, and moved with intention. His loyalty to the people he cared about was deep, sometimes to his own disadvantage, but he never saw it that way. David believed that loyalty was a strength, not a weakness, even when life gave him reasons to question that belief. And when he talked about his future, he spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had never been handed anything, but still found a way to create something meaningful. That future began to expand in 2013, when he met Vanessa Hughes at a charity gala in Midtown Atlanta, a night that felt almost accidental in its timing. Vanessa was striking, confident, and carried herself like someone who had long mastered the art of being noticed in any room she walked into. David was drawn to her laugh and the way she held a conversation with warmth and poise, and she was drawn to the steadiness he exuded without trying. Their early dates unfolded with ease. Late dinners, spontaneous road trips, and long talks about dreams they hoped to chase together. It wasn't long before they married, merging David's grounded nature with Vanessa's ambition in a way that seemed balanced from the outside. To those around them, the Mercers were a couple with momentum, complementing each other in the ways people hoped long-term partners would. The early years of their marriage carried that energy forward. David's trucking business was gaining traction, and Vanessa's career in luxury real estate flourished as she built a client list of high-income buyers across Atlanta. They shared celebrations, traveled often, and spent nights planning how to expand their lifestyle while still keeping each other at the center of the journey. Friends remembered them as a couple who made success look natural, a team who seemed to be reaching upward together. The photos on social media showed a pair smiling on rooftops, beaches, and polished hotel floors. And though social media often hides cracks, in those early years, the smiles were real. There was a rhythm to their life then, steady, optimistic, and rooted in shared goals. But by the time 2024 approached, the rhythm began to shift in ways that were quiet at first, then louder as the months passed. Vanessa's real estate career demanded more hours away from home, and she embraced the social lifestyle that came with high-end clients and late-night negotiations. Their vacations became separate more often than shared, and the photos began to look like moments captured for the sake of appearances, rather than genuine joy. Friends noticed the way Vanessa angled her phone away from David when messages came in late, or how she dismissed his questions with casual explanations about client emergencies. David carried the tension quietly, choosing not to argue, convinced that a calm approach would guide them back to the closeness they once had. But silence can stretch a marriage thin, and he felt the weight of that distance even when he didn't say it aloud. Through all of it, David held on to the small routines that kept him centered, especially after long days managing routes, maintenance schedules, and payroll. Almost every night when he walked through the front door, he placed his Tesla key fob on the kitchen counter in the same spot, a habit that seemed small but carried meaning. It was his way of closing the chapter on the day, one simple gesture that told him he had made it through another round of responsibilities, pressures, and hopes that tomorrow might bring something better. That key fob, resting quietly beside a bowl of mail, became one of the few things in the house that never shifted, even when everything else did. Friends closest to David recalled moments when he let pieces of his worry slip through without fully naming them, like someone trying to hold together something they still believed could be restored. They remembered him saying, "I can fix anything if she just meets me halfway," a line that carried both determination and a quiet plea for understanding. He wanted the marriage to work, wanted the woman he married to meet him again in the place where they once stood together so easily. But as the months passed, the distance widened, and the home he tried to hold together began to feel more like a place filled with unanswered questions than shared promises. The storm wasn't visible yet, but its early winds were building inside the walls of the Mercer home, quietly shifting the life David had worked so hard to build. Before everything collapsed, he still believed things could be repaired, still believed there was a path back to what they once shared. He didn't know that the choices waiting ahead would unfold faster than his patience ever could. He didn't know that the next chapter would turn his quiet strength into the center of a story larger than he could have imagined. And he didn't know how quickly the life he tried to protect would slip into the hands of people he trusted more deeply than they deserved. If you're drawn into this story and want more people you care about to stay aware of the warning signs hidden in tragedies like this one, share this video so they never overlook what could save them later. Vanessa Hughes grew up in Daytona Beach, a place where sunshine covered everything, but didn't hide the deeper lessons she learned early about attention, admiration, and the value people placed on appearances. She was raised in a household where her mother, Lorraine, worked long hours as a hotel supervisor, and her father, Kelvin, drifted in and out of the picture depending on work, luck, and whatever storm he claimed kept him away. Vanessa never said it directly, but she learned young that praise could be a kind of currency, and she noticed how people treated her differently when she dressed well or carried herself with confidence. Schoolmates admired her style long, before they admired her grades, and she leaned into that, realizing that image opened doors, effort alone sometimes didn't. By the time she was in her late teens, Vanessa had already shaped a belief system built around the idea that life respected those who moved like they belonged in better rooms. Her first job as a flight attendant seemed like the perfect match for someone who enjoyed being seen and appreciated the thrill of new places. She loved the polished uniform, the compliments from passengers, the casual conversations that made her feel interesting and admired. Yet even that job eventually felt too small for the version of herself she imagined. The people she met in first class, investors, high-end buyers, entrepreneurs, women with immaculate style, sparked something in her that made her crave a different path. She didn't just want the lifestyle she observed. She wanted to be the woman others looked to as a symbol of it. After a few years of saving, networking, and following real estate influencers online, she made the transition into luxury real estate, confident that the world she wanted was finally within reach. And in many ways, she was right, because Vanessa had a talent for reinvention, and people gravitated toward her ambition. But with every reinvention came new expectations she set for herself. Better cars, larger houses, designer clothes, and a lifestyle where every detail mattered. Vanessa's life became a chase for upgrades, a never-ending climb toward the next version of success that she believed would finally make her feel complete. She worked long hours, curated her image on social media with precision, and treated every accomplishment like a stepping stone toward something greater. Her friends used to joke that Vanessa didn't believe in arrival, only elevation, and she would laugh because it was true. She wanted to be admired, but more importantly, she wanted to feel admired, a desire that grew louder with time. And although she never said it out loud, she struggled with the fear that slowing down or settling would make her disappear into the background of the life she worked so hard to build. By late 2023, the shift in her energy became noticeable to those close to her, even if they couldn't quite define what had changed. Vanessa seemed distracted in conversations, drifting off into thoughts she didn't share, and brushing off questions with vague answers about work stress or client drama. Her phone became the center of her attention, always face down, unless she needed to reply quickly, and her tone tightened whenever David asked simple questions about her schedule. She spent more evenings out, attending networking events or last-minute showings she claimed were important for the brand. But the warmth that once guided her confidence began to feel more like a shield, something she used to protect herself from a growing dissatisfaction she didn't want to confront yet. And while she continued, posting photos of new listings, luxury brunches, and designer purchases, David's presence in her online world slowly faded without explanation. Arguments between them started quietly. Comments about spending, about the direction of the business, about how they should be presenting themselves as a couple on social media. Then the disagreements sharpened, turning into full evening debates where Vanessa insisted they needed to level up and take bigger risks, while David pushed for patience and long-term planning. One night, during a dinner with friends, she made a comment that stuck with people long after the plates were cleared. "If he wants people to take him seriously," she said, swirling her wine, "he needs to start acting like it." Her friend, Kendra, later recalled the awkward silence that followed, a moment where Vanessa's ambition brushed too close to disrespect, and David smiled politely to avoid a scene. That smile, as small as it was, marked a turning point, one side trying to hold peace, the other pushing ahead with demands neither of them fully understood. Her social media grew more polished as her home life grew more complicated. She posed in new outfits on penthouse balconies, filmed quick motivational clips in her car, and built an online persona around beauty, ambition, and a lifestyle she wanted the world to admire. Yet the absence of David in those posts didn't go unnoticed, especially among people who had followed their relationship from the early years. Vanessa brushed off questions about him with lines like, "He's busy with the business," or "We're focusing on different things right now." But her tone hinted at a division that was becoming harder to hide, and although nobody said it to her face, they sensed her marriage was slowly being overshadowed by the pressure she put on herself to be seen as someone who had already made it. Small red flags crept into their daily life in ways that were easy for outsiders to observe, but harder for Vanessa to acknowledge. Late-night showings became frequent, even in neighborhoods where realtors rarely arranged tours after 9 p.m., and she defended them with a confidence that made questioning feel pointless. Her moods shifted without warning, warm one moment, tense the next, and she seemed irritated whenever David asked for clarity about her day. Her phone habits changed too. Incoming messages were dismissed with a quick swipe, or she stepped into another room to reply. When her friend Alicia gently asked if everything was all right at home, Vanessa smiled with practiced ease and said, "I'm just trying to keep us moving forward." But the look in her eyes told a different story, one of pressure, fear, and a desire for something she couldn't name yet. The people closest to Vanessa could feel that she was searching for something beyond success, though none of them could agree on what that something was. Some believed she was chasing validation. Others thought she was trying to outrun insecurities from her past, and a few worried she was simply exhausted from carrying a lifestyle heavier than she admitted. Vanessa wasn't blind to the changes happening inside her, but she didn't know how to slow down without feeling like she was failing. And in chasing the next version of herself, she overlooked the widening space between who she wanted to be and the man who had supported her from the beginning. As her world shifted, so did the foundation of her marriage, though neither she nor David realized how deeply the cracks had already set. Vanessa convinced herself she was simply evolving, stepping into a future she believed they both should want. But each step she took on that path carried her farther from the life they built, and closer to choices that would alter everything in ways she couldn't undo. The storm forming in their home didn't arrive suddenly. It gathered quietly through months of small moments, unanswered questions, and dreams that no longer aligned. And by the time Vanessa noticed the distance between them, it was already larger than either of them could reach across. If you've stayed with us this far, consider supporting this channel by sharing this video with someone you care about. Stories like this remind us how small shifts in our relationships can grow into life-changing consequences. Ryan Cole had been part of David Mercer's story long before anyone in the Mercer household realized how deeply his presence would matter. They met as freshmen at Albany State University, two young men trying to figure out who they wanted to be, while balancing part-time jobs and weekend study sessions that often ran into early morning conversations. Ryan came from a home where bills were always overdue and structure showed up only in short bursts, so he admired how David managed to stay grounded despite his own challenges growing up. Their friendship became the kind people describe as lifelong before they even reach adulthood, built on shared meals, long drives back home, and promises that felt unbreakable at the time. When Ryan was nearly evicted during their sophomore year after falling behind on rent, David handed him half his savings without hesitation, saying, "We'll figure it out together." In Ryan's mind, that moment cemented a loyalty he swore he would never break. When college ended and both men stepped into the uncertainty of adulthood, it was David who suggested they launch a small delivery service together. Ryan didn't have the money or the credit to contribute much, but he had the willingness to work and the deep sense of obligation that came from knowing David had saved him once already. The early years were rough, filled with long days, unreliable vans, and nights spent sleeping inside trucks while waiting for early route pickups. But through it all, their partnership felt like an extension of the friendship they already valued, and people who knew them said their bond carried the strength of brothers rather than business partners. As the business expanded, Ryan relied on David's leadership, grateful to stand beside a man who made stability look effortless even when pressure mounted. And through every milestone, every win, and every setback, Ryan repeated the same line, "I owe you for life, man." That closeness extended into their personal lives as well. When David married Vanessa, Ryan was among the first to welcome her into the fold, making jokes about becoming the honorary third wheel at their dinners and family barbecues. He signed birthday cards with David for their nieces, spent Thanksgiving at the Mercer home more times than he spent with his own family, and slipped naturally into their shared routines. Vanessa liked him at first because he felt familiar, easygoing, helpful, the type of friend who knew how to fix things and make people laugh without trying too hard. Over time, the Mercer household became a second home to Ryan, a place where he could show up unannounced without it feeling intrusive. And David, trusting as he was, always opened the door with relief, grateful for a friend who never seemed too busy to help. By early 2024, Ryan's visits grew even more frequent, though the reasons weren't entirely clear. He came by to help repair loose shelves, to discuss new route plans, or simply to join them for dinner after long workdays. Sometimes he brought takeout for the three of them, filling the kitchen with jokes and stories about drivers who missed routes or clients who demanded the impossible. But David began noticing small shifts in the way Ryan and Vanessa interacted. Shared glances that lasted a second too long. Inside jokes David didn't understand. conversations that paused abruptly when he walked into the room. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it carried a tone he couldn't shake. Still, he kept his concerns quiet, choosing to interpret the tension as stress from work rather than anything deeper. One afternoon in early March, David sat in the truck yard with his sister on speakerphone, his voice lower than usual. After a long pause, he said, "I think I'm missing something at home." He didn't elaborate, didn't name names, didn't accuse anyone, but the sentence carried a weight that suggested he'd been holding on to that thought for far longer than he wanted to admit. His sister, Camilla, told him to trust his instincts, reminding him that intuition rarely shows up without reason. David nodded quietly, staring at the ground as if the answer might appear there first. Yet even with the unease building, he held on to the belief that whatever was wrong could still be repaired if he approached it with patience and clarity. As March unfolded, the energy in the Mercer home grew heavier, and Ryan seemed to be present more often than David could make sense of. He stopped by under the pretense of helping with route scheduling, yet somehow ended up sitting on the couch talking to Vanessa about unrelated topics. Shows she was binge-watching, restaurants she wanted to try, clients she called nightmares in stilettos. David would walk in and catch snippets of these conversations, noticing the ease between them, an ease that once belonged to him and Vanessa alone. When he mentioned it to Ryan one night, Ryan brushed it off with a laugh. "Man, she's like a sister," he said, waving a hand as though the question didn't merit concern. But David couldn't shake the feeling that something in the dynamic had subtly shifted. The night before his death, that feeling grew into something heavier, something he could no longer file away as fatigue or overthinking. He stood in the quiet of his living room, staring at the same walls he had once walked through with confidence, and felt a tension he couldn't define. His phone rested in his hand for several minutes before he typed the message he'd been avoiding. "She's been off lately, man. If anything happens to me, promise you'll look after Mom." It wasn't a dramatic statement, just a quiet truth wrapped in caution, the kind of message a man sends when he feels something closing in around him, but can't articulate what. When Ryan replied with a quick, "You're good, bro, don't think like that," David didn't respond. He simply placed his phone down next to the Tesla key fob he left on the counter every night, a silent gesture that marked the end of his day, and walked toward the hallway. Ryan would later say he thought the message was nothing more than stress talking, a late-night moment of vulnerability from a man under pressure. But those who heard the story afterward questioned the timing, questioned the tone, questioned the history that made the message significant. They wondered what David sensed in those final days, what unspoken truth was forming in the silence of his home, and why he chose Ryan, of all people, to carry that worry with him. And while the world would later examine every detail of their relationship, in that moment, only one fact mattered. David reached out because he trusted Ryan more than anyone else, and when the sun rose the next morning, nothing would ever return to the way it had been. If you're still with us, drop "I'm still here" in the comments and share where you're watching from. It helps this community grow and ensures stories like David's reach the people who need to hear them most. In the last week of March 2024, David Mercer walked into his office with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a while, the kind that made his staff raise their eyebrows and wonder what plans he was working on next. He called his accountant, a calm, seasoned man named Gerald Sims, and asked if they could talk about expanding his fleet. Gerald had worked with David for almost 10 years and could read his tone before his words landed, and on this call, David sounded measured yet hopeful, as if he was preparing for the next phase of a dream he'd built from scratch. He told Gerald he wanted to apply for a $117,000 business loan, a figure large enough to spark questions, but Gerald didn't hear fear or panic in his voice. Instead, he heard determination. David explaining that newer trucks meant more routes, more business, and a bigger future. When Gerald asked if the timing felt right given the stress he'd mentioned earlier in the year, David responded softly, "It's time to level up. Vanessa thinks so too." After the call ended, Gerald leaned back in his chair, thinking about the way David always carried responsibility on his shoulders without letting it harden him. He knew David wasn't reckless. He wasn't the type to take a major financial step without praying over it, thinking through it, and asking himself how it would affect both his business and his home life. But something about the mention of Vanessa lingered with him. Not because he suspected anything, but because he sensed David was trying to meet expectations that didn't originate from him. He told himself to let it go, but later that evening, he made a note in his file. Client appears motivated but under pressure. It was an observation he wouldn't revisit until everything changed. Inside the Mercer home, the atmosphere fluctuated between tense silence and forced normalcy. Vanessa had been pushing for leveling up for months, using phrases like, "We need to match the people we're around," or "You're the face of a business now. Act like it." David listened even when the words scraped against his natural desire for steady, patient growth. He wanted to show her he was trying, that he heard her frustrations, and that he believed in their shared vision, even when the pressure made him feel out of rhythm with himself. In a quiet moment with his friend Jerome, he admitted, "She wants more, and I want to give it to her. I just hope it doesn't push us too far." Jerome tried to comfort him, reminding him that success built on love should never feel like a burden. But David carried the conversation home like a small weight in his chest. As the loan process moved forward, David balanced the excitement of expansion with the unease of knowing something in his marriage wasn't aligning the way it once did. Vanessa seemed invested in the idea of growth, but not in the gentle way she used to be. She brought him articles about successful entrepreneurs, forwarded him listings for luxury vehicles, and made small comments about couples they followed online who were moving up fast. David tried to absorb her enthusiasm without losing his own footing, reminding himself that marriage required compromise, even when the compromise felt heavy. But beneath that desire to make her proud, something else lingered, an internal whisper telling him the foundation wasn't as steady as it once was. On April 2nd, 2024, the loan finally cleared. The $117,000 hit his business account at 8:13 a.m., and David stared at the numbers for a long moment before letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He forwarded the confirmation to Gerald, then sat alone in his truck yard, letting the gravity of the decision settle around him. This was the largest loan he'd ever taken, a choice that would shape the next few years of the company's direction. But even with the magnitude of it all, David felt something quiet inside him. A flicker of hope that maybe this step would close the distance growing between him and Vanessa. Maybe this upgrade would bring them back to the partnership they once celebrated so proudly. That evening, when he came home, Vanessa greeted him with an uncommon cheerfulness. She floated through the kitchen with an energy he hadn't seen in months, pulling ingredients from the fridge, humming to music playing softly through the speakers. It was as if she had slipped back into the version of herself he met years ago, warm, animated, full of charm that made rooms feel brighter. David watched her for a moment, trying to understand the shift, wondering if the loan had eased some invisible weight she'd been carrying. She touched his arm lightly and said, "See, we're moving in the right direction." The words were simple, but something in her tone made him feel both relieved and unsettled at the same time. He closed the laptop gently, placed the Tesla key fob on the counter like he always did, and walked toward the bedroom with the quiet belief that tomorrow might bring more clarity. He didn't know it yet, but this was the last night he would ever settle into bed believing time was still on his side. If you're still watching this story unfold, drop "I'm still here" in the comments and tell us where you're tuning in from. Your support helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. April 3rd began with the kind of quiet that made David hopeful the day would unfold without tension, and for most of the morning, it did. He worked through emails, checked his route schedules, and spent time reviewing the anniversary trip plans he'd been perfecting in secret. By late afternoon, he drove home imagining the smile Vanessa would have when he eventually told her, holding on to the hope that the two of them could still find their way back to the rhythm they once had. When he walked into the kitchen, he found her preparing dinner with precise, almost mechanical movements, answering his questions with short replies, and glancing at her phone more often than she looked at him. It didn't feel hostile. It felt distant, as if she was standing somewhere else emotionally even while sharing the same room. Still, they sat down and ate together, creating a snapshot of normalcy he tried not to overanalyze. Later that night, after they finished dinner and she disappeared to make calls in the other room, David returned to his quiet habit, opening his laptop and reviewing travel confirmations for the anniversary trip he had been planning in secret. He had booked the trip weeks earlier, hoping to surprise her with something special, something that might remind them both why they started this journey together. It was a beach resort she once mentioned wanting to visit, a place where the two of them could slow down, reconnect, and breathe away from all the expectations pressing against them. As he reviewed the itinerary, he imagined the moment he would finally tell her, picturing her smile, holding on to the hope that maybe this gesture could bridge the gap growing between them. Later, when she returned to the room, Vanessa handed him a glass and said he looked like he needed something to relax. David smiled at the gesture, grateful for any sign of warmth, and took a long sip without suspecting the heaviness that would follow. Within minutes, he felt a slow fog settling behind his eyes, a weighted calm he couldn't explain, making him blink more than usual as he tried to focus on their conversation. Vanessa barely noticed, or at least pretended not to, scrolling through her phone while asking casual questions about the next morning's deliveries. He rested his hand on the counter to steady himself, chalking the feeling up to fatigue, telling himself he'd simply overworked and needed a full night's rest. But the distance in Vanessa's tone stayed lodged in his mind, sitting there even as he tried to push the unease aside. He closed the laptop gently, placed the Tesla key fob on the counter like he always did, and walked toward the bedroom with the quiet belief that tomorrow might bring more clarity. He didn't know it yet, but this was the last night he would ever settle into bed believing time was still on his side. The house was quiet by the time he settled into bed, and the silence stretched until his phone rang close to midnight. It was Ryan. Their late-night texts weren't unusual, but something felt different this time. Ryan's text was as though he was choosing his words carefully. He asked if everything was all right and whether Vanessa was still upset about the business decisions. David hesitated, then admitted, "I don't know, man. I can't read her lately. She seems off." Ryan sighed deeply, then changed the subject quickly, almost too quickly, asking about truck maintenance and route changes as if he was trying to steer the conversation away from anything personal. When the text ended, David stared at the dark ceiling for a long moment, feeling a tension in his chest he couldn't shake. April 4th started with a soft sunrise and a quiet determination in David's voice when he sent a message to his sister, Camilla. He told her he planned to reveal the anniversary trip to Vanessa that weekend and hoped it would help ease the strain between them. Camilla responded with encouragement, telling him he'd always been the kind of man who led with patience and kindness, and that love sometimes needed reminders rather than grand gestures. David smiled at the message, taking it as a small push in the right direction, something that helped him move through the rest of the day with a bit more steadiness. But while he remained hopeful, something else was unfolding quietly inside the Mercer home. Behind closed doors, Vanessa's digital trail told its own story. At 10:14 a.m., she searched questions about carbon monoxide. 20 minutes later, she typed queries about autopsy findings and timelines. The searches were spaced out as if she wanted time between them, pausing long enough to avoid suspicion, even though no one else was watching. By afternoon, she was researching garage safety systems, specifically focusing on how long a car could run before a person lost consciousness. Her face was calm each time she clicked through the results, her fingers steady. It was the kind of behavior that would only reveal its meaning once everything else was already over. The night of April 4th blended into the early hours of April 5th, and just after midnight, a camera near the Mercer driveway recorded the soft glow of headlights turning into the property. At 12:39 a.m., David's Tesla rolled into the garage. The car moved slowly, steadily, as though guided by muscle memory rather than full alertness, and once it came to a stop, several seconds passed without any movement inside. 4 minutes later, 12:43 a.m., Vanessa's SUV pulled out of the driveway. The taillights drifted down the street until they disappeared, leaving behind a sealed garage and a silent house. At 12:47 a.m., the auto-close system activated, lowering the garage door and locking the space in complete stillness. The neighborhood remained quiet through the night, unaware that something inside the Mercer home had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. It wasn't until around 9:40 a.m. that the stillness broke. A neighbor named Mrs. Blake stepped outside to bring in her trash bin and heard the faint hum of an engine. Steady, low, almost trembling. She paused, listening harder, then noticed a thin line of smoke seeping from under the Mercer garage door. She walked toward the driveway, knocked firmly, and waited. When no one answered, she called out again, louder this time, her voice echoing across the yard. Another neighbor, Mr. Willis, joined her, concern creasing his forehead as he bent down to look at the smoke spreading across the concrete. They tried knocking once more, and when the silence remained unbroken, Mrs. Blake took a shaky breath and dialed 911. She reported exactly what she saw: a car engine running inside a closed garage, smoke coming out, no answer at the door, her voice trembling enough for the dispatcher to ask if she was safe. Minutes later, police arrived, their body cams capturing the moment the garage door was forced open, releasing a wave of trapped air and fogged exhaust. There, inside the silver Tesla, David Mercer sat motionless, his phone glowing faintly in his lap, as if waiting for a message he would never send. His last 48 hours were quiet, full of small choices and private thoughts that only gained meaning after the truth emerged. And as officers stood there taking in the scene, the question that would define the rest of the investigation began to form. A question no one was prepared to answer yet. April 5th unfolded into a day filled with questions no one was prepared to ask. And in the hours after David's body was discovered, the first wave of assumptions formed faster than facts. Detectives walked through the Mercer garage, taking in the sealed environment, the locked car doors, and the steady hum that hinted at a quiet passing rather than a violent confrontation. The initial impression pointed toward a man who had sat down in his car and never stepped out again, and the lack of struggle inside the Tesla only strengthened their first conclusion. When the medical examiner arrived, the early readings supported what the scene already suggested: carbon monoxide poisoning, a method that required no weapon, no intruder, and no outward conflict. By midday, officers quietly shared a working theory in low tones. David's death looked like a suicide. It was not a theory born of certainty, but of surface-level logic, shaped by a crime scene that offered more silence than clues. As the investigation began, the details seemed to fall into familiar patterns detectives had seen before. The garage was sealed tight, the door automatically locked, and the car itself showed no signs of tampering, creating the picture of a man who intentionally isolated himself. Toxicology from the earliest scans showed levels consistent with prolonged exposure, and none of the exterior doors of the home appeared disturbed. Detectives walked the property twice, checking windows, checking ground impressions, checking camera angles, and every inch of the scene told the same story: no forced entry, and no evidence of anyone else being inside at the time of death. In the absence of obvious conflict, investigations often default to the possibility of self-harm, especially when the environment presents a closed-loop scenario. That line of reasoning created a momentum of its own, nudging investigators toward assumptions even before interviews began. Vanessa was brought in for questioning that afternoon, and her demeanor added another layer to the forming narrative, though not the layer detectives expected. She walked into the room composed, her posture straight, her breathing steady, answering each question with a kind of practiced ease that made her seem strangely disconnected from the gravity of the situation. When asked whether David had shown signs of emotional distress, she answered quickly, saying, "He was stressed about money," as if the explanation had been waiting on the tip of her tongue. She did not stumble over her words, did not pause to gather her emotions, and did not break down the way most spouses did in these interviews. Detectives took note of her tone, her timing, and the absence of visible grief, marking each observation quietly without challenging her directly. In cases like these, behavior doesn't determine guilt, but it often shapes suspicion. What unsettled detectives more was the rhythm of her answers, short, precise, almost rehearsed. Every response seemed crafted to lead them toward a conclusion rather than offer insight, and each moment she spoke felt like a narrow window rather than an open view. She mentioned arguments about money, long work hours, and the pressure of business decisions, yet none of her statements matched the calm domestic routine the neighbors described the day before. When one detective asked if David had talked about harming himself, Vanessa exhaled slowly and replied, "He was overwhelmed. I don't know what was going through his mind." Her voice never wavered, never cracked, and never softened. It was the kind of interview that left officers with more questions than answers, even while the physical evidence still pointed toward suicide. Meanwhile, the investigators examined David's smartwatch data, and what they found contradicted the emotional landscape Vanessa had painted. Instead of elevated heart rate spikes or indicators of panic, the readings showed a calm resting state leading up to the time of death. His heart rate moved in slow, steady intervals, resembling that of a man relaxing at the end of a long day, not someone fighting for breath. This incongruity pressed lightly on the edges of the suicide assumption. If David had willingly sealed himself inside the garage, most cases showed heightened physiological responses, moments of hesitation, or signs of distress. But David's data remained steady, almost peaceful, almost unaware. Investigators noted it, logged it, and set it aside for further examination. The more the detectives learned about David, the harder it became to reconcile his profile with the early suicide theory. Interviews with coworkers revealed a man who showed up early, motivated his team, and spoke openly about business expansion. His drivers described him as grounded and dependable, the kind of leader who didn't make impulsive decisions or hide private turmoil. One young driver recalled David joking about taking the crew out after he finished his anniversary trip, adding that he had a lot to be grateful for this year. Friends confirmed he was planning a surprise getaway for Vanessa, a gesture that didn't fit the actions of someone preparing to end his life. Each interview chipped away at the initial impression, but without clear evidence of foul play, the suicide theory remained intact. No reaction was as strong or as immediate as the one coming from his family. His sister, Camilla, was the first to voice complete rejection of the theory, her voice firm when she told detectives, "My brother didn't live like a man planning to leave us." She emphasized his faith, his sense of responsibility, and the protective way he cared for their mother, insisting that nothing about him aligned with self-destruction. She recalled how he had texted her just one day earlier about the surprise trip, and how excited he sounded, describing him as a man building toward something, not walking away from it. To her, the idea of suicide wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. Her words didn't change the investigation overnight, but they lodged deeply enough that detectives wrote them down verbatim. Over the next several days, from April 6th through April 12th, the investigation quietly stalled between two realities: the evidence that suggested suicide and the voices insisting it wasn't. Detectives continued reviewing the garage, the car's internal logs, and David's recent financial moves, yet nothing obvious surfaced to shift the official ruling. Vanessa provided them with statements about stress and arguments, but the emotional hollowness of her interviews continued to leave a strange aftertaste. David's business partners emphasized his plans for growth, and his family emphasized his faith and loyalty, creating a contradictory portrait that never settled into certainty. The official cause remained carbon monoxide poisoning, and the official stance leaned toward suicide, but the case still carried a quiet, persistent discomfort, the kind that grows in the gaps between facts and intuition. By April 12th, the investigation had reached a temporary standstill, holding on to conclusions that felt too shallow for a life as complex as David Mercer's. And though the case was not yet reopened, the doubts lingering in every corner of his life made one thing clear: nothing about David's final moments would stay buried for long. Within 48 hours of David's death, while his family was still scrambling to process what happened inside that garage, Vanessa contacted the insurance company and submitted a $1.2 million claim. The request moved faster than many death notifications, arriving before some relatives even learned the full details of how David was found. Her tone on the call was measured and direct, giving the representative exactly the documents they needed with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed the process long before tragedy struck. Detectives noted the timing, writing quietly in their logs that her actions didn't match the behavior of a grieving widow. They matched the behavior of someone executing a plan. Still, no one challenged her yet, because without proof, timing alone could not build a case. But it was the first sign that the investigation had left the realm of grief and entered something far more calculated. Between April 10th and April 15th, neighbors began whispering about the car parked in Vanessa's driveway late at night. They had seen Ryan's sedan more times than they could count during David's life, but the visits now carried a different weight. These weren't drop-ins or casual route planning sessions. These were long stays that stretched past midnight, sometimes with the lights dimmed and the blinds pulled tighter than usual. The neighborhood had never been one for gossip, yet even the most reserved families couldn't ignore how quickly the boundaries between friendship and something else seemed to blur. What unsettled detectives was not the possibility of an affair, but the timing. How easily Ryan stepped into a role that only weeks earlier had belonged to David, and how comfortable he seemed doing it. Their movements weren't illegal, but they raised a question investigators couldn't shake. How does grief turn into companionship this fast? On April 16th, another detail disrupted the quiet narrative Vanessa tried to maintain. She walked into a midtown bank and opened a new account, under her maiden name, Vanessa Hughes, signing the paperwork with a coolness that surprised the teller assisting her. There was no hesitation in her voice, no quiver in her hand, only a firm request for privacy and expedited service. Within hours, large transfers began moving in. Chunks of the $117,000 business loan David received just days before his death. The pattern of transfers formed a trail, small enough to look intentional and spaced enough to appear cautious, yet consistent in a way that spoke to purpose rather than panic. When detectives later reviewed the financial logs, the movements felt less like spontaneous decisions and more like someone rearranging the pieces of a puzzle they'd already assembled. Nothing about the new account aligned with grief. It aligned with preparation. As the financial trail expanded, the emotional distance between Vanessa and David's memory widened. She stopped returning calls from his family. She avoided friends who asked too many questions. And she carried herself as though the worst was behind her, even as the community struggled to understand how she had processed tragedy so quickly. Meanwhile, Ryan's presence grew even more pronounced, slipping into spaces David used to occupy, picking up mail, carrying items into the house, and staying long past the hours that made sense for someone offering comfort. Detectives watching from afar saw a pattern forming, a quiet choreography between two people whose lives were already blending before anyone realized how tangled their stories might become. April 18th marked the moment everything shifted. Just 2 weeks after David's body was pulled from the garage, Vanessa walked into a luxury dealership in Midtown Atlanta with Ryan at her side. The two moved with the ease of people celebrating a milestone, not mourning a partner whose autopsy hadn't yet been finalized. Sales staff later recalled how Vanessa ran her hand across a Ferrari F8 Tributo like someone greeting an old friend, smiling with the kind of confidence that didn't match the timeline of her loss. When it came time to pay, she pulled out cash, $310,000 of it, packed neatly into envelopes that looked freshly counted. The dealership accepted the payment, and Vanessa posed beside the car while Ryan stood nearby, barely concealing his pride. Hours later, she posted the moment online with the caption, "New beginnings. God always provides." The post spread rapidly, not because of its glamour, but because of its timing. Detectives saw the photo too, and something clicked. It wasn't the Ferrari that caught their attention, but the cash. The amount, the timing, and the way it was presented didn't match any reasonable timeline for a widow 2 weeks removed from losing her husband. It forced investigators to dig deeper, tracing the origin of every dollar tied to Vanessa's recent transactions. When forensic accountants examined the physical envelopes used at the dealership, they noticed serial numbers that didn't belong to the bank from which she withdrew funds under her maiden name. Those numbers matched withdrawals made from David's loan account, money intended for fleet upgrades and business expansion. Not luxury vehicles, not new lifestyles, and certainly not a celebration staged with his closest friend. The realization created a ripple through the investigative team. What had once looked like a closed garage suicide now carried signs of a planned dismantling of David's life. The financial transfers, the insurance claim, the rapid companionship between Vanessa and Ryan, and now the Ferrari. All of it built a picture investigators could no longer ignore. The early suicide theory no longer fit the evidence. It no longer matched the behavior they saw. And it certainly didn't match the money trail that now stretched across multiple accounts and a brand new sports car. By April 19th, detectives reopened the case formally, shifting the classification from suicide to suspicious death. The money trail was no longer a side note. It had become the backbone of the investigation. What began as a quiet morning in a closed garage was evolving into a story of motive, opportunity, and choices that pointed straight back to the people closest to David Mercer. The Ferrari wasn't just a purchase. It was the turning point that forced the truth to surface, one envelope at a time. By April 20th, detectives no longer approached the Mercer case with calm routine. The Ferrari purchase, the cash envelopes, and the timing of Vanessa's choices had pushed the investigation into a different category, one that demanded digital forensics rather than assumptions. They began by subpoenaing the Tesla logs, digging into the car's internal systems for a minute-by-minute understanding of David's final movements. Tesla vehicles record everything: door status, seat sensors, garage interactions, and automation routines. When the data arrived, a pattern appeared immediately. The garage auto-close schedule had been programmed weeks earlier, long before the night David died. It wasn't a default setting. It wasn't an accident. It was a custom routine, one someone in the house had intentionally created, and detectives were about to find out who. The next subpoena targeted Vanessa's phone, and when the data extraction finished, the timeline sharpened with chilling clarity. 3 weeks before David's death, Vanessa had manually adjusted the Tesla automation through her own device, setting the garage door to close automatically minutes after the car entered. The logs showed her exact fingerprint access, her exact timestamp, and the exact device ID tied to her account. She didn't argue the evidence when confronted, only saying she didn't remember setting anything. But the logs told a different story, one in which her fingerprints were etched into the automation that sealed David inside a toxic environment. It was the kind of detail investigators often dream of finding, because it removes guesswork and replaces it with certainty. From there, detectives turned to her search history, and the results deepened the unease that had been growing for weeks. There were detailed questions about carbon monoxide, its effects at different concentrations, how long it took a person to lose consciousness, and whether sedatives could still be detected after cremation. The searches weren't scattered. They were precise, spaced out, and purposeful, like steps in a checklist. One investigator noted that the queries began before any recorded marital conflict in the last month, meaning her curiosity about lethal methods didn't appear tied to an emotional moment. Instead, it aligned with planning. The digital evidence began forming a picture that felt less like impulse and more like blueprint. Toxicology reports were then re-examined under new suspicion, and this time, the lab focused on sedatives instead of carbon monoxide alone. Buried beneath the primary findings, a new result emerged: traces of zolpidem in David's system. It wasn't enough to cause death on its own, but it was enough to incapacitate him, especially in the quiet of his own home. The prescription was registered under Vanessa's medical file, not David's. Investigators compared dosage levels and timing, concluding that he had been given the sedative shortly before entering the garage. The revelation struck detectives hard because it connected directly to the possibility of premeditation. Carbon monoxide alone could be framed as suicide. Sedatives in the bloodstream turned it into something else entirely. The next break came from neighborhood security footage. Cameras from 2 houses down caught a small but critical detail: the shape of Ryan's sedan near the Mercer home on the day of the tragedy earlier than he originally claimed. The timestamp placed him near the property before David's Tesla pulled into the garage, contradicting his first statement about when he arrived. Investigators slowed down the footage, enhanced the lighting, and confirmed the make, model, and license plate. He had been there at a time that held meaning. A coincidence was possible, but the timing cast a shadow that grew darker with each finding. Detectives prepared for another interview with him, knowing this conversation would not resemble the first. The Mercers' home door cam had been cleared. When Ryan walked into the interrogation room for the second time, he carried the same calm posture he always had, but his eyes moved differently, less steady, more guarded. Detectives began by confronting him with the footage of his car near the house. He swallowed hard but tried to explain it away, claiming he was dropping off equipment early. Then they presented the Tesla logs showing the automated garage routine. His face tightened. Finally, they placed the toxicology findings and Vanessa's search history on the table between them. Something shifted inside him then. A crack, small but visible. Silence settled into the room, heavy enough for both detectives to notice. Under mounting pressure, his resolve finally broke. Words didn't spill out all at once. They came slowly, pulled from the fear sitting at the edges of his voice. He admitted that Vanessa had asked him to check the garage later that night, claiming she was worried David had been drinking. He said she told him not to disturb him, only to make sure the car engine had shut off. But when he arrived, David was already unconscious, slumped back against the seat, the fog of carbon monoxide filling the space around him. Ryan paused then, shaking slightly, before admitting that Vanessa told him exactly what to do next. He confessed that he entered the garage, opened the Tesla door, and repositioned David's body so it looked peaceful, hands resting naturally, head tilted slightly, eyes closed. He said the scene looked too chaotic originally, and that Vanessa insisted it needed to look calm so nobody starts asking questions. At one point, he hesitated, covering his face with both hands before revealing the rest. He wiped the steering wheel and the exterior door handle, removing his prints and any trace that he had entered. He claimed he didn't want to be involved but felt pressured, pulled into something he didn't fully understand until it was too late. Detectives asked why he didn't come forward earlier, why he hadn't tried to stop any of it, and why he had stayed silent while Vanessa moved money, filed claims, and bought the Ferrari. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he looked up with a hollow expression and spoke the line that closed the room into absolute silence. She said, "Once he's gone, we'll be unstoppable." Those words didn't just implicate him, they rewrote the entire case. They finished a puzzle detectives had been piecing together since the moment a neighbor called 911 about a car running in a sealed garage. And with that confession, the investigation shifted from suspicion to certainty. Vanessa had not only played a role, she'd orchestrated the plan from the very beginning. When August arrived, Atlanta prepared for a courtroom battle that didn't feel like a trial. It felt like a reckoning. Reporters crowded the steps of the Fulton County Courthouse every morning, adjusting microphones and snapping photos as spectators lined the walkway just to catch a glimpse of the woman now known across the country as the Ferrari widow. The nickname didn't come from cruelty. Atlanta's media gave it to her because of the image she presented to the world. A grieving spouse posing beside a $310,000 car only 2 weeks after her husband's death. By the time she stepped out of the transport van on August 12th, cuffs on her wrists and camera shutters echoing across the plaza, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. She walked with a blank expression, eyes forward, shoulders stiff, as if the world owed her silence instead of answers. David's family watched from the courthouse steps, their faces tight with a grief that had not faded since April. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors were prepared with a case built brick by brick from every digital footprint Vanessa thought she had hidden. They opened with the loan records, walking the jury through the timeline of the $117,000 that David believed would help expand his business. The prosecutor, a firm-voiced woman named Alicia Warren, displayed the banking statements on a large screen, letting the jurors see how the money vanished into Vanessa's new account under her maiden name in the days following his death. Each transfer left a mark, timestamps, amounts, patterns, and the more Alicia explained, the quieter the room became. It wasn't just financial movement, it was the unraveling of motive. Next came the search history. Detectives testified about the queries pulled from Vanessa's phone: carbon monoxide exposure, autopsy timelines, sedatives in cremation, and garage automation triggers. One juror shifted uncomfortably as each search appeared on the screen, the steady progression of topics painting a story of intention rather than confusion. The defense tried to argue that anyone could search unusual topics out of curiosity, yet the order of the searches, combined with the dates they were entered, left little room for innocence. Alicia spoke in a steady tone as she pointed out how Vanessa's research intensified shortly before the night David died, and the courtroom responded with the kind of silence that usually follows truth. The Tesla logs followed next, and those were harder for the defense to dismiss. A forensic technician explained how the garage's auto-close routine had been programmed weeks before the incident, directly through Vanessa's device. He broke down the fingerprints, the timestamps, and the settings, showing exactly which phone logged in to create the automation. Vanessa watched from her seat, hands clasped together, her face unreadable. The jurors, however, reacted with small shifts, leaning forward, crossing arms, nodding quietly, as they absorbed the significance of automation that operated with cold precision. It was the kind of evidence that didn't rely on emotion or eyewitness memory. It relied on raw data, and data rarely lies. When toxicology results were introduced, the courtroom's atmosphere dipped into something heavier. The medical examiner described how zolpidem, Vanessa's prescribed sedative, was found in David's system, and how the amount present suggested he had been incapacitated before the carbon monoxide exposure began. He explained that David would not have understood the danger he was in, nor would he have been able to fight for air or attempt escape. This wasn't a man choosing to give up. This was a man stripped of the ability to respond. David's mother wiped her eyes as the examiner spoke, while several jurors lowered their gaze, absorbing the weight of that final piece of evidence. But nothing struck the courtroom more sharply than Ryan's testimony. He walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit, wrists shackled, shoulders slumped, and carried the expression of a man who had spent months wrestling with consequences he couldn't outrun. The prosecution asked him to recount everything he confessed: how Vanessa sedated David, how she instructed him to check the garage, and how he repositioned the body to make the scene look calm and untouched. His voice cracked when he admitted wiping the steering wheel and door handle, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of being pulled into a situation he didn't know how to escape. The courtroom leaned in as he delivered his final admission, the line that echoed through newsrooms and social media for days afterward. She said, "Once he's gone, we'll be unstoppable." The jury didn't react outwardly, but something shifted in the room. A quiet acceptance that whatever doubt lingered had now dissolved. Vanessa's defense attempted to push back by claiming Ryan acted alone and manipulated the evidence to frame her. They argued he was jealous of David, desperate for money, and overpowering in presence. But when Vanessa took the stand, her demeanor worked against her. She spoke with calm detachment, answering questions without emotion, and offering explanations that didn't match her digital trail. Jurors watched her carefully, noting the lack of sorrow, the absence of remorse, and the contradiction between her words and the evidence. Her coldness didn't convict her, but it didn't help her either, especially when weighed against the financial transfers, the automation logs, and Ryan's detailed confession. The trial lasted just over 2 weeks, and by the time closing arguments ended, the courtroom felt heavier than when it began. Prosecutors reminded the jury that David had lived with hope, not despair, planning an anniversary trip and expanding his company. They emphasized how Vanessa dismantled his life in silence while pretending to stand beside him. When the jury left the room to deliberate, the stillness was thick enough to touch. 6 hours later they returned. The verdicts were read without hesitation. Vanessa Mercer, guilty of murder, conspiracy, and financial fraud. Life without parole. Ryan Cole, 30 years under his cooperation agreement. As the words settled into the air, Vanessa didn't flinch. She sat with the same blank stare she had carried since the morning of her arrest, showing neither rage nor regret. David's family embraced one another with trembling hands, not cheering, not celebrating, only releasing a breath they had held since April. Behind her, David's sister leaned forward, her voice breaking into a whisper that cut through the silence. "That's not the woman my brother married." For them, justice didn't erase pain, but it finally brought truth to the forefront. Atlanta left the courthouse that month carrying a lesson it wouldn't forget. Sometimes the most dangerous betrayals are the ones built quietly, over time, by the people closest to us. When the courtroom lights dimmed and the media vans finally left the courthouse steps, the aftermath of the Mercer case settled over Atlanta like a quiet storm that refused to move on. Mercer Trucking, once a symbol of David's discipline and slow, steady rise, shut its doors within weeks of the verdict. Drivers who had called him Boss D packed up their lockers with a heaviness that had nothing to do with lost wages and everything to do with losing the man who once believed in them when no one else did. The empty lot that once held the company vans became a reminder of how quickly a business built on loyalty can crumble when the person who held it together is no longer there. Former employees still gather sometimes at a small diner off Highway 29, trading stories not out of habit but out of gratitude, because remembering him aloud feels like the only way to keep his spirit alive. The Ferrari, once flaunted online with a caption that angered the community, never hit the road again. Detectives seized it as evidence, then locked it away in an impound facility where it sits behind a steel cage, its bright exterior muted under layers of dust. People driving past the warehouse don't know the story behind the car sitting inside, but those who followed the case know exactly why it never returned to the streets. It became a symbol of choices made without conscience, of money moved in shadows, of a life taken so someone else could live larger. The car was supposed to represent luxury and freedom. Instead, it became the anchor that pulled the truth to the surface. At home, far from the noise of reporters and public debate, Ruth Mercer spent her mornings in a quieter world shaped by grief. She kept David's things exactly where he left them, not because she lived in denial, but because each item preserved a memory she wasn't ready to let go of. His shoes stayed by the front door. His work jacket remained on the hook. His favorite coffee mug sat by the sink. And inside a small wooden memory box on her dresser, she placed the Tesla key fob he set down every evening when he walked in from work. She opened that box often, running her thumb across the smooth metal, remembering how he used to kiss her cheek before heading out for another long day. That tiny gesture, a simple routine, became the last piece of him she could still hold. Across Atlanta, the conversation didn't fade with the verdict. In barbershops, church halls, neighborhood porches, and local diners, people talked about how charm, ambition, and the desire to chase status could twist into something dangerous when mixed with entitlement and deceit. They spoke about how a man who lived with patience and loyalty found himself caught in someone else's hunger for more. Community leaders held small gatherings where they discussed financial manipulation, partner violence, and the quiet warning signs people often ignore until it's too late. And through those discussions, David's name surfaced again and again, not as a headline, but as a reminder of how betrayal can hide behind smiles, routines, and promises spoken in quiet rooms. In the months that followed the trial, investigators released a summary of their findings to the public, outlining the digital footprints, the financial maneuvers, and the timing that led to the case's breakthrough. People were stunned to learn how small details, like an automated garage setting or a search typed into a phone in the middle of the day, became the clues that brought justice forward. Even now, students at local universities studying criminal justice use the Mercer case as an example of how technology can expose truths that people try to bury. Professors point out that the case wasn't solved by a dramatic confession alone. It was solved by carefully following the trail left behind by someone who believed they had erased everything. Ryan serves his sentence at a state facility outside Atlanta, often requesting counseling sessions he once avoided. Guards say he keeps to himself, spending long hours in the library or lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. Some believe he was swept into something he never fully understood until it was too late. Others believe he reveled in an opportunity he never would have earned otherwise. Vanessa, on the other hand, remains at a maximum security prison with no chance of parole. She rarely speaks, rarely writes, and shows little interest in visitors. her life became the opposite of everything she once posted online. No attention, no admiration, no luxury, no applause. Only walls, silence, and consequences she built with her own hands. For David's family, healing isn't a destination. It's a slow, uneven journey. They cook his favorite meals on his birthday, visit his gravesite with fresh flowers, and tell stories that make them smile through tears. His nieces still talk about how he showed up to their school plays, no matter how busy he was. His friends still replay the last voicemail he left them, just to hear the warmth in his voice one more time. And every year, on the date of his death, they gather in Ruth's living room and share memories that soften the ache, even if only for a moment. As time moves forward, the lesson left behind by David Mercer remains clear. His life wasn't defined by the way it ended, but by the way he lived, steadfast, honest, and full of quiet strength. The narrator closes the story with the truth that carries the weight of everything that unfolded. David used a $117,000 loan to build a future. Someone else saw it as an exit plan. In the end, the loan wasn't the crime. The betrayal was. And now, as we close this chapter, your voice matters in keeping David's memory alive. And type "Justice for David" if you believe trust should never cost a life. Which story do you want us to cover next? Drop your suggestion in the comments. Your engagement helps bring awareness to cases that deserve to be told.